Well, Dr. Martin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Arlena.
Yeah, listen, this is going to be a really important topic. You wrote a book called Cutting Ties with Your Parents, a workbook to help adult children make peace with their decision, heal emotional wounds, move forward with their lives. And as soon as this came across, I was like, oh, yeah, I immediately thought of like two or three people I know that need to make this decision.
Mm.
Maybe one that already has, and I know they wrestle with, like, all the things that you talk about, the guilt and the shame, boundaries, and events and stuff. So we're gonna cover all the things, but, before we jump into it, can you tell me what your experience is with things around adult children and maybe addiction? How has that affected your life?
Sure. I mean, I can share a little bit of my personal connection and my professional work. This has been the focus of the clinical work that I've done with clients. So there's certainly a big connection there from years of working with adult children. Um, Along the way, but also just in terms of my own experience. So I guess I would say there's sort of two components here, for me in terms of adult child work. And, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we've really broadened our understanding of what it means to be an adult child. This was really very specifically adult children of alcoholics was really the
Right.
beginning of
Slash dysfunctional families,
well,
I
yes,
most
yes,
recently
right.
found out.
That came later, right? And
Mhm.
I think like a lot of things related to understanding the family dynamics of addiction or how families are affected by the disease of addiction, is that we've realized that the dynamics are very similar in other kinds of dysfunctional family as well. So, the
Yeah,
whole it all got brought into dysfunctional families. And,
yeah.
that's really what I did in my work as well. I really started off working very specifically with adult children of alcoholics. And then it all gets very messy and very muddy very quickly anyway, because, families tend to have a variety of different, forms of dysfunction. And sometimes it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not, always clearly in one box that, we've got addiction, sometimes there's mental health stuff going on. Sometimes there's just combinations of different kinds of things. And now, of course, we have a lot more awareness of, things like narcissistic personality and how that affects families. And, there's a lot um, online, I would say, about that. Currently, it's not
Yeah,
really, it's new, but I'd say it's sort of new in terms of our awareness, maybe, of
yeah, it
that.
seems like there's I would say in the last couple years, maybe a few years, there is a lot of talk online about either narcissistic partners or parents, and I hear that a lot in recovery rooms where people
Mm.
are talking about having narcissistic parents. Did you grow up with narcissistic parents or alcoholic parents?
No, nope, actually, neither. I would say I grew up with codependent parents. And that's the other piece of all of this,
Mm.
is that, um, so this is my, understanding of it. I would say, both of my parents have some degree of codependency, which they then pass down to me. And so I grew up feeling like there was sort of something wrong, but it was very hard to articulate what it was. Um, and so, if I look at the literature, the laundry list from adult children, or, some of the other material, there's lots of great books and resources
Yeah,
for adult children. If I look at that, I can identify with a lot of it. And so
yeah.
that ends up being a very puzzling experience of saying, well, what is it that's going on here? And really, what it is, it's that generational effect that's going
Yeah.
on. And again, now there's definitely much more talk about generational trauma than there was, when I was growing up. Um, but there's not a lot specifically that's written about generational codependency, I would say. Um, There was one book that really spoke to this. It's called Grandchildren of Alcoholics by
Hmm.
Anne Smith. And it's an older book. And last time I checked, it was out of print. So I'm guessing it's pretty hard to get your hands on a copy of it these days. But that was really one of those beginning books that really talked about the generational effects of codependency. And obviously hers was specifically about alcoholism, but again, I think it applies to a lot of different forms of dysfunctional families, and the way that that gets passed down to, grandchildren, and even beyond that, certainly. So that was definitely something that was really impactful for me, is being able to make some of those connections and
Yeah.
say, like, okay, well, what is it that's going on?
Yeah.
Some of those things that just went unspoken. Or just right, some of the ways that my parents dealt with problems or related, in the world, um, obviously came from their upbringing. And of course, it makes perfect sense, right, that it gets passed down, to the
Yeah.
way that they parent. So my parents, were good parents. But I certainly picked up on some of those things that, um, for me, ultimately caused me some challenges in my relationships. And then I ended up marrying a man who is an alcoholic and an addict. And
Oh,
so,
there it
right.
is.
So, exactly, there it is. You're exactly right. So, it's like, I was like, I feel like, well, the foundation was laid and
Yeah.
then it all got built. Right. And so,
Yeah.
yes, it all sort of came to its head and was then very obvious. Right. And then it's like the codependency slapped me in the face.
In all fairness to our parents, it's like they didn't get the coping skills either, right? And so we learn from their behavior. And I grew up in a very it's so funny because I've been sober for a while and I was exposed to ACA pretty early on, but I didn't know that it was adult children of alcoholics slash dysfunctional families. And I was like, well, shoot, everybody could qualify for that. Like the
Yeah.
person that doesn't relate to that, they're the oddity, like they're the outlier. Most people, I think, have a degree of codependency. And the way codependency kind of showed up in my house is around responsibility. Like
Mm.
I later learned that I took inappropriate responsibility for my mom and my sister, and I did not take appropriate responsibility for myself.
Hmm.
And it led to some pretty confusing dynamics in our house. How did that play out in your family?
Oh, for me, it was very much about um, approval seeking,
Ooh, that's a
um,
big one.
needing to be the perfect kid.
Mhm.
Um, I would say, sort of
I bet
layered
you
on.
got good grades.
Oh, yes, I was a very good student. I always did my homework.
Nice.
Right, I was definitely a perfectionistic kid who needed to be just right. But I didn't want too much attention. Um, I just wanted to sort of fly under the radar. And for me, right, being the A student and following the rules and doing everything that everybody expected of me was the
Mhm.
way to do that. Um,
What would happen if you didn't get the good grades, or do you recall what you were afraid might happen if you weren't the perfect child?
well, it was, I would say, sort of losing my parents' love, was
Mhm.
probably really what it was. Um, Having people be angry with me, having people be disappointed in
Ooh.
me. Um, And so I mean, honestly, there weren't a lot of times that I experienced this because I worked really hard to always do the right thing, because it was very painful for me. And this was another thing that
Right.
I learned about myself, is that I am a highly sensitive person. And so I felt things really deeply, and criticism was much more painful for me. And again, that
Mhm.
really, was part of wanting to please everybody, as well. So, I would see, my sister, who would get in, not a lot of trouble, but more trouble than me. you know?
I was like your
Right,
sister. I was the one always
right.
getting in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't a bad kid, but, it was definitely okay, I'm not gonna do that. I don't want
Yeah.
negative attention on me,
Right,
so
right.
let me do, the right thing all of
Are
the
you
time.
older than your sister?
No, I'm the middle child, so,
Oh,
yeah,
me too.
she was
Yeah.
the oldest, and then, yeah, I've got a younger sister
So you
too.
saw your older sister getting in trouble and you were like, I am not doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, there's just a certain amount of it that I just feel like is really hardwired,
Yeah.
into who I am as a person.
Hmm.
Like, again, there's a certain amount that's sort of how my nervous system operates.
Yeah.
That's very sensitive to everything.
Yeah.
And so again, it just feels like it's a natural thing to want to avoid anything that is painful. And so,
Right.
you work really hard to create a situation where you can avoid painful experiences. But I mean, the downside here is, of course, that I was putting a ton of pressure on myself that was completely
Right.
unnecessary. Like nobody
Yeah.
else was really, high, putting this extremely high expectation or standard on me. Most of it was
Well, it's
internally
all
imposed.
self-imposed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, my parents, obviously wanted me to do well, but they weren't, cracking the whip and, telling me, I had to get an A++, which, some parents do. Some
Right.
are, really hard on their kids. But that really wasn't the case.
That
It
wasn't
was
your
really,
experience.
yeah, it was just, I felt I always needed to be, the best, perfect at
Yeah,
everything.
that's exhausting.
Yeah,
It's a tough.
absolutely.
I mean,
And
it has its plus sides. It has its pros, right?
right, right,
like
obviously,
I called you doctor today.
yeah, you accomplish things and, right, you
Right.
get things done, and
Yeah.
I mean, and that is the upside, and I think that's often what people see is just, well, this looks very successful. It looks like
Hmm.
you're checking all of the boxes and you're, a well-adjusted kid and, you're going to college and all those kinds of things, but, yeah, it is
Do you have a lot
really.
of like anxiety and all that
Absolutely.
kind of stuff? Yeah.
Absolutely. There's definitely a lot of anxiety that's underlying that and
Yeah.
self-criticism and really because it's an impossible standard, you just never feel like you're good enough no matter how much you're achieving.
Oh, that's
It
brutal.
right, it's never enough because it's, you can't actually be perfect. So you're
Hmm.
constantly pushing yourself and pushing yourself, but right, it's just literally never enough. So you're working, working, working. And yeah, for a long time, I had a really hard time just relaxing, having
Right.
fun. I would
Yeah.
still say
Little
sometimes
workaholism,
yeah,
maybe?
sometimes that's still challenging to just let myself, right, have fun. I mean,
Yeah.
um, I wouldn't say I didn't have any fun as a kid, but again, it just doesn't feel like it comes natural. Like I'm much more comfortable working. Yeah.
I hear that. Yeah, I'm a purple junkie myself, so I
Hmm.
relate. This idea of never good enough, that's one of those things that, I see it in myself. I have an adult son. We had a conversation recently where, a frank conversation where he pushes himself really hard at school. And, I'm like, we had, this frank conversation about like, what's driving you? And when it came down to it, it's just like this very deep seated
Hmm.
belief of not good enough. And I wonder, there's like the typical solutions of like journaling and meditation. And what are some of the ways that maybe you have used personally to sort of combat that? Are there some mindset shifts? Are there actions people can take to sort of kind of move away from that default thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're already on the right track with it is because one of the things we do want to remember is like if we're talking about perfectionism, it's not all bad. Like there are a lot of positive aspects to
Mhm.
it. And so
That's
nobody is
true.
going to want to just say, oh, just stop working or, don't worry about your grades. You know, spend more time having fun. I mean,
That's what I tell my son. I go, you need to have some more fun.
right, but it's sort of counterintuitive to the person who feels like how is that going to help me achieve what I either
Right.
internally or externally feel like I need to be achieving. And
Yeah.
so I always think of it as sort of just trying to dial it back a little bit and try to
Okay.
hold on to the parts that are serving you well, right? So having high standards is good, right, for ourselves, for other people, but having impossibly high standards is not
Mm.
helpful anymore. And so, if we can get ourselves into a place of, okay, what's realistic or what's really necessary for the situation, because not every situation really demands all of our effort, all of our, best work. Some do, absolutely. But if we're sort of across the board putting everything into a category of this has to be perfect,
Mhm.
right? I mean, then we're sort of wasting time and energy on stuff that doesn't require that level of, effort or detail.
Yeah.
So if we can sort of separate out, what do I really need to, put my effort and time into? But there's also this other component of, how do you actually feel good about who you are, and needing to separate who you are from what you do,
Oh, that's a big one. Can you say that
right?
again?
Yeah, because so often what we're talking about is our self-worth is connected to our achievement.
Mhm.
Right. So what I am doing is now equated with who I am as a person.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a nasty trap to get stuck in, because that's exactly what I was talking about. Like, now we're
I would
on the
like to get out
hamster
of
wheel,
that.
right? We're on the hamster wheel of I have to do because I constantly have to prove my worth to you,
Right.
to me. Right. And then again, that's the approval seeking. And it's just a variation of needing other people to approve of us.
So
So anyway, yes, we
how
want
do
to
you
get back to,
how
yeah.
do you separate like having inherent value as a person not tied to achievement? Because I feel
Mhm.
like I'm on that hamster wheel, and every once in a while I get a glimmer of, oh, maybe I can get off, and then right back on.
Yeah. Well, some of it I think is connecting with your values as a person and
Mhm.
thinking about your strengths as a person. And again, maybe very specifically trying to look for ones that are not about achievement. Um, there's also, I think, trying to connect with the idea of inherent worth. And I think if it's a new idea or it just feels uncomfortable, it might be something to continue to sit with, to do some reflection on. Oftentimes, these are ideas that it's much easier for us to apply to other people. And we say, I don't have a whole lot of trouble with the idea that you are inherently worthy, but I struggle with applying it to myself. And again, if we can
Right.
sort of investigate, well, what's that about? Why am I struggling with this idea of believing that I was born worthy and that is a fact, and it's not something that changes with, my productivity level or my accomplishments.
Right.
Um, so I think for some people there is a spiritual or some other sort of higher power connection, I think,
Mhm.
in that, right? For some people, it is the idea of God, and God made everybody worthy, and you don't need to prove your worth. That may or may not be an idea that resonates with everybody, but I think if it's
Right.
helpful for some people, they can go with that. Others might sort of take that and expand upon it, or, find a thread in there that, um, does mean something to them, and think about, is there something bigger than them that,
Right.
is has something to do with this idea of worth, and who or what decides um worthiness. I mean, that sort of makes me think of just the other piece of it that I remember is this idea that if you're looking for approval, or you're constantly seeking that approval from the achievements, you're really giving that power to somebody or something else rather than holding it for yourself, right? The
Mhm.
idea that I can decide for myself how I feel about myself
Yeah.
is very empowering, right? That's really a good thing to feel like this is in my control. I mean, it's really a basic thing about self-esteem, how I feel about myself,
Yeah.
right? Versus letting other people decide. And again, like that has that codependent feel to me of just
Yeah.
sort of, you're just sort of blown around in the wind, that everybody else is deciding for you who you
Right.
are and what you're about and how much you're worth, instead of like feeling solidly in in the sense of self, of saying I know who I am and what I'm about, what's important to me, and those are all things I can control.
Yeah, I did this exercise where you go on Google and list and just search for positive character traits.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to be like, okay, pick 10 of these and then just read it every morning.
Mm-hmm.
Just positive character traits. Because you're right. You said earlier that we, tend to identify with how we look or our achievements or a role that we play. Like the work that I do or the role I have as a mother or a wife or
Mm-hmm.
a daughter, something like
Right,
that.
right.
So it's interesting to get those character traits and just to go, okay, these are these are and
It
I
is, yeah.
I actually did a little exercise with my son because he was so overwhelmed by the schedule that he had, they just went back to school.
Mm-hmm.
So we sat down and got the calendar out and we mapped out all his classes. And then we mapped out his work. We mapped out the commute time. And then we mapped out prep time. Like, what do you need to prep for the day? And then I was like, if you did all this stuff, would you then feel like you were doing enough? And he was like, yeah. So it was really nice to have like a visual representation. He went on his merry way. And I was like, I need to do that for myself.
Mm-hmm.
It was so
Mm-hmm.
easy for me to do it for him. I was like, that's a great exercise. So,
That reminds me of sort of a similar exercise that they had us do at a college parent orientation thing, and it was sort of this idea also, sort of, managing schedules and expectations. And
mm,
part of this exercise was, accounting for all the time it took to do all of these different activities, and then realizing there was like not enough time left for any kind of self-care or even
right,
8 hours of sleep, or something along those lines. So it was like, really, you got to pay attention to, those are really important activities as well. And, you can't just focus on, schoolwork and going to classes. I mean, those are important, obviously, but if
right.
you, right,
Yeah.
have used up, 20 hours of your day, on those activities, it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, and that's what we do. And listen, I don't think we're any better, right? There's just so many things that we can do and just not enough hours in the day to get it all done. So I like Cal Newport is an author and he recently published the book. The title escapes me, but his whole point was we need to do less.
Mm-hmm.
I think Essentialism by Greg McEwen sort of, there's so many books that all say the same thing as we all need to be doing less and we do those things well and still maintain our sanity. So that's really important. But let's sort of get back to, sorry, took you down a little rabbit hole there,
Oh, that's
but
okay.
it's all connected, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about the book because cutting ties with your parents is like the main title, but there is a road to just get to that decision. And it can be a long road with a lot of suffering. You talked about codependency, that's sort of established in childhood, and your parents become these very like powerful figures in your life. And even as an adult, it's hard to sort of break out of those patterns and sort of blaze your own trail. So, and I love that this is a workbook, right? So with questions and all the things. So let's talk about what makes somebody get to the point where they feel like they need to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'll just tell you from my experience is I have never known anybody who came to this decision lightly or quickly. It has always been after literally years of agonizing, years of trying to make the relationship work. Um, And again, I mean, this is, I think reflective of those codependent tendencies that so many adult children have is, again, wanting to please their parents, um, the societal pressure that there is to maintain relationships with your family, again, sort of indiscriminately, not even considering what those family relationships are like. We get these messages that they are obligatory, they're essential, there's something wrong with you if you don't have family relationships. So all of this comes into play, and folks are just, really at the point of a breaking point, I think,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
they literally don't know what else to try. They feel like they have exhausted every single option. And again, for a lot of them, it's also been maybe on and off, I would say, in terms of trying to set boundaries and trying lots of different forms of low contact or no contact and then resuming contact. This is very common, is that, there's years of trying to find some middle ground that
Right.
works, which I think makes sense. Um, but it's important to remember, whether it's you or somebody that you care about who's in this situation, is that this is not a decision that anybody has just said, you know, today, out of the blue, um,
Yeah.
I'm just not going to talk to them anymore. Or,
Yeah.
right. It sometimes seems that way from the outside because this isn't, something that probably people are talking to unless you're very close to that person. So again, if it's a casual friend or a colleague, there's probably, a lot going on that they haven't been telling you, the years and years of abusive behavior, hurtful
Yeah.
behavior, rejection, lack of acceptance for who they are as a person, disrespect, violating boundaries, and this is really sort of, I would say, what I'm characterizing as what's going on in the relationship as adults. And it's not even about, all of the history, because that's important too. I mean, in my experience, it's generally there's a long history of problematic behavior and them having been treated poorly as a child, but then this continues into adulthood in a different variation of it. Because if there had been childhood trauma, but then there had been the ability for the family to heal that, work through it, acknowledge it, apologize, change behavior, right? Those are situations where relationships can be saved. But we're really
Right.
talking about situations where, um, again, in this particular situation, we're talking about the parent or the family member being unwilling and unable to acknowledge that they are
Yeah.
mistreating somebody and unwilling to change that behavior.
Yeah, that's so interesting, the unwilling and unable. Like, the unwilling seems like that would be super frustrating and almost like a dangling carrot, like, they do seem like they're capable of changing, like, sometimes I've seen, or heard of parents that can demonstrate an ability to change for some siblings, but not others. Or at work, they can behave appropriately,
Mhm.
but at home, they, act in a way that's like selfish or in a betrayal sort of way. But so I think as a child to witness your parent behaving appropriately sometimes, and then that has got to be so hurtful.
Yeah, and I think you can probably relate to this idea too, that even, again, sort of whatever form the dysfunction is there's often the ability to present to the outside world as functional, right? So it's
Yeah.
all a hot mess at home, but the school doesn't see it. The parents come in and they
Right.
look presentable and they respond, and the friends don't realize it unless they're really, spending a lot of time at your house. But again, like, it's the same kind of dynamic, is that,
Right.
right? Sometimes an alcoholic can, behave perfectly fine at work and nobody has any idea what's going on. It's
Mhm.
that same thing where people are extremely good at hiding dysfunction.
Yeah.
Um, and it is confusing because it
Yeah.
seems like, well, why, you're capable of it, so why can't you do it all of the time?
Yeah, I would
Um,
imagine that it's just so, it would be so hard not to take that personally, and that damages your self-esteem, and you second guess yourself. Am I crazy? Then the parents gaslighting, like, what are you talking about? Like not admitting it, not admitting that they're doing these things. I mean, that I'm
yeah,
sure all contributes to the decision of cutting ties.
yeah, I think on a certain level, we just have to stop wasting our time, I think, in trying to understand why somebody is refusing to change,
Yeah.
because it doesn't change that that's the reality of the situation,
I
right?
think
Whatever's causing it, you know, it'd be, I mean, I understand the curiosity. We all have a natural desire to understand ourselves and other
why.
people, right?
Yeah. But
But again,
asking why is a that in itself is a hamster wheel, don't you think?
yeah, well, and I think it so often leads us back to self-blame, right? Because
Right.
that ends up
Oh,
feeling like the easiest answer
must be
to
my
the
fault.
question,
Yeah.
right? Especially like when you were talking about, there are definitely families where there's the golden child, there's, one or two of the kids who don't seem to be treated in the same way. And
Mhm.
again, the logical conclusion that people make is, well, there must be something wrong with me, right? If I'm the
Mhm.
scapegoat and I'm the one, who's always blamed, it's got to be because there's something wrong with me. And
That
so,
is
I mean,
so
right.
painful.
Yeah. And it's not a helpful way of understanding the family dynamics, because I think it could have been somebody else. It just happens to be you.
Yeah. So if somebody finds themselves in this place where it's been a lifetime of disappointment and frustration and pain and, abuse, where do they start with the decision of I'm going to cut ties? Like, is this where enter the workbook? Is that where this comes into play?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it. It's a very personal decision. So it's hard to say, here's the line.
Right.
I think where that line is for anybody is going to vary. And it's almost as if, again, I think it's sort of similar to hitting rock bottom. It's like
I was just thinking that.
you sort of have to go through the process to get there. You can't
Yeah.
jump ahead in the process and say, I should be ready. But because if you're not ready, you're going to keep trying
Yeah.
until you're really at the bottom and you said there, I just can't do it anymore. I'm so
Yeah.
hurt. I'm so broken. So whatever, that I'm done.
I'm done. Yeah. I was just, when you were saying that, I was
Yeah.
literally thinking, rock bottom is when you decide to stop digging. And getting off the why train. It's like, okay, it doesn't matter. It's like trying to understand crazy. It's not understandable. That's why it's crazy.
Yep.
Right. And so at some point we surrender and we say, okay,
Absolutely.
I'm cutting ties. The I would imagine the challenging thing with parents, like so quit drinking when I was 25. I decided I had enough and I literally could not do it anymore and I quit. Alcohol cannot come chase me. Do you know what I mean? And I'm thinking, even though I see it at weddings and funerals, like I know that that's part of,
Right,
we'll
right.
talk
It's
about. I'm
out
gonna
there.
ask you about that. Yeah, I'm gonna ask you about that too. But it can't come talk to me like your parents can. Your
Right.
parents can try to call you, they can send you things, and so once you've made the decision, is this something that requires support? Like, is this why people reach out to you and they get some therapy and they join a support group? What is like in an ideal situation, how would you support somebody through cutting the ties and setting
Yeah, I
boundaries?
mean, absolutely. People need support. It is a very isolating experience, I would
Hmm.
say, overall. Again, because it is stigmatized for people to
Yeah,
do this. The other thing that often happens is that people lose other relationships, especially within the family, sometimes
yeah,
with other support people who just don't understand why they're doing this. Um, but oftentimes other family members, because it's so divisive
yeah,
that people often feel like they need to take sides within the family.
Oh,
And
yeah.
again, it's often the people that are the loudest, that have the most power, that um right, and often that's the parents in this situation, right? They're the ones who are controlling the narrative. And
Yeah.
so again, and power is a big piece of it. So people feel like, oh, I better take their side.
I have a friend who's I'm just going to say parent in case she's listening, whose parent is very sick
Mhm.
and does this whole victim poor me thing. And so she will, put distance between her and her parent. And then the parent's siblings reach
Mhm.
out. It's like, oh, you're such a bad daughter. They could really use your support. Why are you
Oh,
being
yes.
like the shame? I mean, they bombard her with guilt and shame, and
Mhm.
it's crippling.
Yeah, and there's literally this pressure to reconcile. I mean, that's
Yeah,
another huge piece of what's so taxing about it is just like you said, there will be other family members, there will be friends, there will be the guilt trips, the
siblings
manipulation,
and
right, of saying, what's wrong with you? You need to
yeah.
help mom and dad out. You're abandoning them. You're a bad daughter. You're a bad son. This is your
How could you
obligation.
do
Right.
this?
We're counting on you. Yeah. And again,
Oh,
so I mean, right, you can see how when you
yeah,
don't do what everybody's expecting you to do, you get that shunned by other family members as well. And so again,
right.
back to your point of, right, the need for support is huge.
Yeah,
And we all know, I mean, how powerful it is to connect with people who just truly get the experience and have been there or had similar experiences and say, yeah, I understand why you're making this decision. I'm not judging you for it. I support
mm,
you around this. And so, yes, that can be, I think there's a lot of power in peer support.
yeah,
Definitely there's a different kind of important support that people can get from professional therapy or coaching kinds of support as well.
mhm.
But the other, sort of longer term, I would say, goal of support is also to build that surrogate family, a chosen
Oh,
family for yourself, right? If you don't have contact with your, biological family,
mhm.
um, right, there is a void. And I don't
Yeah,
want to underestimate that, right? I mean, it's to say, but your biological family is not the only group of people who can fill that space and fulfill
yeah,
those roles and be a support system for you and show up for you and give you unconditional love, right? We're talking about just finding that in other places and building those relationships again with other people who want to do that with you. And that's
yeah,
all possible. It's not something that happens, in a couple of days or weeks. But I
right.
say that's sort of one of those longer term goals of, connecting with people who are going to be your chosen family.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned having some peer support and professional support. And the one thing that I found so valuable with peer support is somebody who could just hold space for me and allow me to name my feelings without them having to have any kinds of answers for me.
Mm-hmm.
The most magical words I've ever heard is, I could see how you'd feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Just validating my feelings was so helpful as a somebody that was a peer support. What
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things happen in professional support that is different from that kind of peer support?
Well, one of the things that happens is the relationship itself with a therapist. And this is, I would say, probably across the board, no matter why you're going to therapy,
Yeah.
is that there's a healing power in having that relationship that is that is a safe place. It is a safe relationship. And that's part of what we
Yeah.
do as therapists is try to create this sense of emotional safety for
Hmm.
people.
Yeah.
So, right. So again, there's some of those same things where, I mean, it's normalizing your feelings. It's making sure that you don't feel judged. And it's not my job as a therapist to be telling you what to do. It really is for you to be able to explore whatever is coming up for you and to recognize that that's okay. And again, it's often a very different kind of relationship
Yeah.
than people have had with anybody else in their life. And it almost can be sort of an aspect of reparenting, I would
Yeah.
say, right? Because
Yeah.
a therapist can be like the loving, unconditional love that you never got from your
Yeah.
parent. Obviously, we don't want to create a dependency there, but it can be really healing in that way to experience somebody
Yeah.
who just cares about you no matter what you say or do. You know that they're in your
Yeah.
corner and they're there for you and they're going to support you. And then obviously there are other things that therapists do as well in terms of specific techniques that they might use, whether that's helping you develop, coping skills or learn how to set boundaries,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
process trauma. There's, lots of different ways that therapists do that. But, I would
Yeah.
say that, the relationship itself is probably the most important piece of it.
Yeah.
And
That's
that's
super
true,
found. Super
true of,
found.
yeah,
Sorry.
that's
I get
okay.
so excited. I get so excited. No, that is emotional safety. Like I really felt that because I feel like that is the foundation. You create emotional safety, and then when we feel safe, whatever we've been suppressing is safe to arise. And
Yeah.
then, and then you talk about, processing trauma. I think that is the biggest. I think that is it takes training and talent to be able to navigate somebody else's trauma. Like you maintain your professional, like you don't put your stuff like I feel like the difference between peer support and professional support is a
Mhm.
professional can help you somebody facilitate their trauma by not like infusing their own trauma into the
Yes.
situation.
Yes, that's very important. Thank you for bringing that up. You're right.
Yeah.
And again, I think peer support is
Vital.
invaluable.
It's
Yeah,
vital.
absolutely. But you're right. I mean, it does sometimes run that risk, and there are
Yeah.
times where um, a peer's trauma can sort of be triggered,
Yeah.
and then that comes up, and then it ultimately can sort of derail the emotional safety that we're talking about. So this is
It can
what,
ruin the relationship too. Like
yeah.
I come from 12-step environments and when I was first sponsoring people, I was terrible at it.
Well, it becomes, I think, overwhelming for people. If I'm in my own trauma and now you've put your trauma out here too, it's tough to be able to manage both at the same time.
Sorry about that.
That's
That
okay.
was that was definitely me. I think
just just froze up and then you're gone. But
it's like nobody cares. Okay, I was telling you a story about how
uh,
so when I first got sober and became a sponsor to other women, I was terrible at it at first because I was so like enmeshed with their feelings. Like when people are
yeah.
first getting sober, they're going through really intense situations. I remember specifically this one gal I was sponsoring was having a pretty serious issue with her husband, and I just got so like it consumed. I got so enmeshed that it like consumed my life.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and when, the difference between a peer support and professional support is when you're a peer support person, they have access to you 24/7.
Hmm.
So I had like no boundaries. And anyway, I was terrible at it.
Well, right. I mean, and there's much more of the mutual give and take,
Yeah.
even right with sponsor and sponsee. I mean, you're both gonna, hear each other's stories. And I think, right, it's part of that process, which is unlike therapy. Like we're in the therapy, world, we're very much about, therapists need to do their own work before they become therapists. I mean, it's an ongoing process, obviously,
Yeah.
but understanding the importance of no, kind of having your stuff, under control so that it doesn't spill out and start to infect the relationship, or it becomes about me and what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. I can't be sitting there getting triggered by the things that my client is saying, because, then it's no longer going to be that safe space where
Oh,
the
right.
focus is on helping them manage what's going on, for them in that moment. So yeah, there's, lots to be gained from peer support, but it's even that it's not all created equal. I would say,
No, it's
and
not.
people need to, I think, sort of gauge what's working for them. And if they're very
Right.
overwhelmed when they're going to a support group or a 12-step meeting, maybe that just is a sign they need to, make some adjustments there, whether it's a different
Yeah.
a different meeting or, do some therapy
A
first.
different sponsor
Right,
or
exactly.
combination of all the above.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying. I do think both are super vitally important. But it's important, I think, as a consumer that we sort of know what those roles are and what to expect from each role.
Mhm,
So I think
mhm,
that's really helpful. Can we talk a little bit about how to handle specific situations? I noticed that there's um, some different scenarios. Like if you decide to go no contact with your parents, you've blocked numbers, you've moved, whatever
yeah.
whatever you have to do, but there's a wedding or there's a funeral or there's something like that. What are some tips that you can offer somebody who's in that situation? How would they handle those things?
Mhm. Well, first, I would say there is no right or wrong answer. Again, it's very much thinking about what is the best decision for you in this moment. So, again, we want to avoid judging other people's decisions or judging our own decisions with the idea that there is like a perfect solution to come to here. I would say often these kinds of situations, it feels like there's really no good choices, and it's more
Mhm.
a question of choosing the least bad choice,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Be true
Because
to
yeah,
yourself
like
and
it's painful no matter what you do. I think is often
yeah.
the reality is going would create one set of challenges. Not going creates a different set of challenges. So again, I can't tell you which is the better option for you. And what's the better option for you might be choice A today, and 6 months from now, it might be something different. Because again, dynamics change, our needs change,
Yeah.
family circumstances change. So we're really weighing each situation for its, unique qualities and what's going on in this. I wouldn't say people need to make these blanket decisions of, I'm never going to Christmas with my family ever again. Now, that may be true and really helpful for some people. For other people, it might feel better to say, you know what, I'm just going to make those decisions as they come.
Okay.
Because um, let's just throw out an example. Maybe it's, you've really needed to cut ties with your father because of his particular behavior. Maybe your situation will change if after he passes away, maybe you would want to go and see your mother or the rest of the family. Maybe
Um,
not, right? I mean, I can't know, but those are possibilities, just understanding that things are going to change. So I think, one piece of advice is definitely don't pressure yourself to sort of, if you made a decision, you're allowed to change your mind. Nothing has to be decided,
yeah.
today that is
Yeah.
forever. Um, and yes, do what feels like it's the best thing for you, and then be realistic about what to expect. If you decide you are going to have some contact, be very clear with yourself about what that is and what that entails. You're going to be much more successful if you have clearly defined what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and where you're going to do it, instead of just some general idea of, I'm going to go to the funeral or I'm going to go to the wedding. But instead, think about, how long are you going to be there? Who are you going to sit next to? What's your plan if somebody says something hurtful to you? If, the person who you're having issues with violates a boundary, like have an action plan. You need to be prepared. And again, this really requires us to be honest with ourselves about what's likely to happen. Obviously, we can't, predict, but, we could use history as a pretty decent guide on what to expect from people.
Yeah.
Um, so having that
That's
plan,
good.
and again, we always know, like, always have an exit strategy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
you always want to know that you can leave if something is not going to plan.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I like
really
that
important.
idea of like having a support buddy there, knowing
Yes.
like plan it out ahead of time, what specifically you're going to say, and having an exit strategy.
Yeah,
How would you
that's a great one.
how would you suggest somebody like what's the process of what is the grieving process like? You know,
Mm.
there's guilt, there's grieving. It's like no matter you know what I found of all the years I've been working with people and you know that are in sort of the recovery space is that no matter how bad the parents treated them, there's always a little piece of them that still loves their parent, and that is what makes it painful.
Absolutely.
And that's what needs to be grieved.
Again, I mean, we are hardwired to love our parents, to want their approval. So they're hard ties to break,
Yeah.
because it's so much of our biology, I think. Um, I'm sorry, I lost track of what your question
Oh, the guilt. Like,
was.
how do we grieve?
Oh, yes. How do we grieve it? Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's
Grieving's
a big
no,
question.
it's a really big piece of it, but I think often it's the thing people want to skip over.
Oh, yeah. Nobody wants
Yeah,
to feel that
right. I mean,
part.
yeah, it's uncomfortable, but it's also very confusing
Yeah.
because there are often feelings of sadness or longing or missing somebody, but there can
Yeah.
also be like side by side, there can be this relief that, again, it's just confusing. Like, how could I miss somebody who treated me so poorly? And why am I missing somebody when I'm the one who decided to end the relationship?
Yeah.
Right. It sort of seems like it doesn't make any sense, but it actually makes perfect sense.
It's
Right.
messy.
Right. When you think about it, because again, yeah, we can have all kinds of conflicting feelings at the same time. And
Yeah.
absolutely, we know that we can miss people, even if they really weren't good for us or they treated
Yeah.
us poorly. Um, so I think acknowledging all of those mixed feelings can be really helpful, and knowing that it's completely normal to feel that way. Um, but we want to really sort of connect with what is it that we have lost in this situation.
Mm.
And sometimes that's sort of tangible things that we can identify, but other times it's these intangible things or sort of these ripple effects, which might be, again, other relationships that get lost because of that. Or a big one for folks is the loss of what I would say is sort of the dream that things
Yeah.
were ever going to change, that my parents were ever going to show up for me in the way that I needed them to and wanted them to. So it's like that hope is now gone, right? And that's a
Yeah.
big piece of what we have to accept is we are saying, okay, this relationship is never going to be the parent child relationship that it should have been, and that's hard. I mean, again,
Yeah.
because it's intangible, it's something that never existed, but of course that you wanted and longed for. But that's a huge loss.
Huge
And
loss.
yeah, and it's a tough one to grieve.
Yeah.
And it's a tough one for other people to understand. um but for me, I mean, that's the first part of any grieving process is understanding what it is we are grieving, right? What
Hmm.
is it that we have lost? um and then really allowing ourselves to have whatever feelings we have about that, and finding some healthy outlets for those feelings, finding ways to process those feelings, giving them that space with the idea that we're going to move through those feelings so that we can move beyond them ultimately, instead of just stuffing them down, and then
Processing to
they
resolution. Yeah.
yes, yes, otherwise
No
they just keep
stuffing.
popping up. Yeah,
They really do. They're like little goblins, little jack in the boxes that pop up at the most inopportune times.
for sure.
Um, wow, there is so much to unpack here. But listen, there's a whole book.
Yes. True enough.
There's a whole book. It's a workbook. I love me a workbook because
Yeah.
sometimes, and I think this is like the beauty of having a really good therapist is they know what questions to ask and they know when to ask them, right? And so the book is full of guidance that can help you unpack all of this kind of stuff. And even if you're not going through cutting a parent off yourself. Those of us that are in recovery rooms, we all have friends that struggle with this.
Mm,
So I think this is such a helpful conversation to know how to be a good peer support person. And, this will be a great resource for
mhm.
people that are going through it. So, if people are interested, obviously everybody needs to buy the book, but if people are looking for some more support, where can people contact you or connect
Hmm,
with you?
hmm. Yeah, my website is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. And there I've got lots of articles that I've written. There's a free quiz there that people can take that's about dysfunctional, toxic family traits. So sometimes that's a good one for people to get some insights about their family.
We all love a
And
quiz.
yeah, good quiz. And yeah, I've got lots of other free resources and newsletter and all that good stuff. So people can visit me there.
That's great. I will leave links to all the things in the show notes. But listen, thank you so much for
Mm,
writing this book. Well done. And thank you so much for your time today.
thank you. Appreciate it.